Hello, welcome, Velshkomi, to today's Icelandic National League of the U.S. webinar. My name is Jackie Flatten. I am a volunteer with this wonderful nonprofit organization that celebrates all things Icelandic. We are really happy to have you here for our presentation today. Before we get started, I just want to mention a couple things. First, this program is being recorded and will be available through the INLUS website. Second, as attendees to this program, you are muted, but we do encourage questions and we will have a Q&A session after our guest presents. To ask a question, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a phone or a tablet, that button might be in the upper right corner. And finally, a little plug for joining INLUS if you are not yet a member. We'd love to have you, and now is a good time to join. It's not only for those with Icelandic heritage, but for anyone who is interested in this fascinating country, its otherworldly landscape, literature, history, and art. Just go to www.inlus.org and click on Join Us. Okay, now on to today's program. We are very excited to have the Emmy Award-winning filmmaker Pamela Hogan here to tell us about her upcoming documentary, The Long Friday. Exactly 47 years ago today, the women of Iceland went on strike to gain equality. And this event made a huge impact not only in Iceland, but it inspired others across the globe. So Pam, thanks so much for giving us a look at all that's gone into the making of this important film. Maybe start out giving us a little bit about your background and more about this exciting project. And I'll let you just take it from here.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I want to thank Diane Okinski and Doug Hansen for what they've done putting this event together, and to all of you for participating. I mean, what better way to celebrate the 47th anniversary of the Women's Day Off than this? So I'm an independent filmmaker, for many years, an executive producer of global documentaries at PBS, and I'm an adjunct at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. And I think it's fair to say that through my entire career, I've been drawn to stories about ordinary women doing extraordinary things. So how did this film get started? Well, back in 2015, my family and I went on a trip to Iceland. Our youngest son was just about to head off to college, but his college was starting a little later than his friends. So he actually agreed to go on a trip with us. So off we went, and as many of you know, it was just an extraordinary experience. Here's a photo that my son took at the famous Kerrid crater. This is a volcanic crater lake in South Iceland, and Björk, the artist, held a concert here because the acoustics are so great. So on this trip, right from the start, I started noticing the women, and it's like they were all wearing like really cool boots, and there were these statues of women all over the country, not even just in Reykjavik, out in the countryside. And then one day I was flipping through the guidebook and I found a sidebar towards the back about the day in October 1975 when 90% of Iceland's women went on strike to protest being underpaid and undervalued. And they walked off the job and out of their homes, refusing to work or cook or take care of the kids. And they brought the country to a complete standstill. Planes couldn't take off, telephone lines were down, schools and factories were closed, and the stores ran out of hot dog because apparently that's all the men knew how to cook. And that day triggered changes that have made Iceland today a global leader in the fight for gender equality. So basically my head exploded. I thought, first of all, how do you get 9 out of 10 women anywhere to do anything at the same time? And I just immediately started trying to find the film that someone must have made about it, but there wasn't one. And while that surprised me, it wasn't that much of a shock because in my years at public television, I saw how often women's stories are overlooked. But I also saw how when they are told, they really make a difference. So when I came home, I couldn't stop talking about this. And finally, a friend said, Pam, just shut up and write a proposal. So I did, and I got our first R&D funding, and we did our first shoot. And now it's 6 years later and one pandemic later, and we're finally in the final stages of editing. My collaborator, Hrapa Gunnarsdottir, is an acclaimed Icelandic filmmaker with long experience making films about Iceland's women's movement. And you'll hear from her in a few minutes. And our story researcher, Eidir Styrkarsdottir, is a historian and the former director of the Women's Archive in Iceland. And with them and our wonderful team on the ground, including our DP Helgi Felixson, we've done 5 more shoots and tons of archival research, lots of translation, because everything about this movement is in Icelandic, so we had to have it translated into English. And we're incredibly excited about bringing the story out into the world, which will happen at the end of the year. So here's just a very short trailer to give you an idea.
Almost all the women in Iceland are on strike today, some 60,000 of them. It's National Women's Day there, and the women are refusing to work in factories, stores, communications offices, and even their own homes.
Society was paralyzed.
Everything was closed.
This is one of those frozen moments in your life. I remember the clothes I was wearing.
And all these women want something. They want to change the society. It's like a revolution.
The message was, you can do it. We need to stand together. It's unacceptable, the lives of women in Iceland, and we are going to change it. And so we did.
Over the years of working together, producer Hrapa and I have talked a lot about our cultural collaboration and what each of us is bringing to the story. Me as an American and she as an Icelander. And so I asked her to share her thoughts. She's in Tenerife at the moment on a much deserved vacation with her family, but we recorded a short conversation.
Can you share why you feel it's important to tell this story?
Well, it's a story that I have been telling in Iceland for quite some while, starting with some projects in 2015, and then also some documentaries I produced earlier. I think the story is extremely important at this point in time, and it's important that it's told by an outsider, which, I think, the outsider, Pamela lends it a unique view because of the status of the world. I feel like every corner of the world is dealing with, in some way or another, kind of a backlash against women's rights, backlash against human rights. And it sort of has given a new life to this type of activity everywhere in the world. This is a very unique story. I don't think it has really happened in this way anywhere else in the world. And I think at this point in time, it could almost act like a blueprint or an idea, hopefully spark ideas of how to change things, how to make people involved in equality, the idea of equality, which I think is, from a democracy point of view, I think it's extremely important at this point. Have these voices heard and have these stories told that have really never been told to the outside world.
I feel as though these women that we're speaking with are like living historians.
Absolutely. They are like a living museum, each and every one of them, which is marvelous. And, I think they kind of know, that what they did was unique, but I don't know, it's something has prevented the story to be told to a greater audience. And I think this is extremely important to do at this point in time.
Hrapa mentions the timeliness of the film. And as it turns out, just as our film will be released, a children's book about the strike is going to be coming out as well. It's written by an Icelandic author whose mother-in-law participated in the strike. And we're really excited about the synergy between our projects. So Jackie asked me to share a few of the challenges we've encountered on this journey. And I said, well, how much time have you got? Because first of all, time is working against us. This happened it's a race against time. This happened 47 years ago. And even when we started, some of the key participants were no longer with us or able to really participate. And we've been doing these interviews as quickly as we could with women in their 70s and 80s and 90s, keenly aware of the time passing and people's circumstances changing. And I'm sorry to say that several of the people who we have interviewed on film are no longer with us. And if their stories had been lost, it would have been a crime. So that has been the central challenge and the urgency from day one. And then there was the pandemic. There was a lockdown on travel to Iceland. I tried to get a ticket. The planes weren't going. So we had to figure out how to make progress on the project during that time. And we actually did manage to pull off 1 week of filming. Our crew in Iceland worked with a very minimal crew to, minimize exposure, and they took all the tests and sanitized everything. And we figured out a way for me to be in the room asking the questions on a computer, and it worked. And we're going to show you. Yeah, this is a frame of me on the computer interviewing the president of Iceland, fabulous historian Gudni Johansson, about his experience the day of the strike. He was 7 years old, and his mother went off to demonstrate, leaving his father to cook. So his father told the boys that he'd be making hot dogs, and they were thrilled about that. They never got to eat hot dogs. And then he describes in great detail the tragic look on his brother's face when he realizes that the hot dogs have been burned because his father doesn't know how to cook. But we were really, it was, like productions everywhere, just trying to be resourceful and figure it out, and really happy that we could move it forward, even though I couldn't be there. Another challenge, of course, it's an independent documentary, fundraising. Any independent filmmaker will tell you they spend sometimes more time fundraising than making the film. We have recently received a grant from Iceland's Film Commission and from RUV, their national broadcasting system. And that's been a big help in getting us to the finish line. But the last challenge has been, how do you visualize a story about something that happened so long ago? And there is archival material. There's some, black and white footage, even a little bit of color Super 8, and people, have old family photos and so forth. But as far as really documenting what happened, there's a scarcity there. So I've long been interested in the use of animation in documentaries, and some of my favorite documentaries have interwoven animation with archival and storytelling, interviewing. So I started thinking that would be a breakthrough for us. You didn't see that in the short clip that we just saw, because that clip was made some time ago, but we're now working with a fabulous young artist, Joel Orloff, who's creating animated sequences that really have an ability to kind of bring to life the dreams of these young women and how they felt about the rigid way that they were, expected. For example, one tells us, from the time I was 12, I wanted to be a lawyer. So he shows the animated version of her gesturing in front of a jury, and then she says, but everybody told me, no, dear, you'll be married before you're 18. And so he has a wedding veil kind of lasso her around the neck and thump her into the floor of a kitchen. She's sort of trapped in the kitchen. Now, by the way, this woman did not let what they said stop her, and she became the first woman appointed to Iceland's Supreme Court, and eventually became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But what's very special for us is the way that his animation can bring those feelings to the viewer that maybe couldn't even happen if there were a Super 8 of her as a child. So that's been exciting. If you can show, Doug, the next, these are some of Joel's initial sketches. You'll see a jail guard on the right. That's because one woman told us that her mother had 6 children and had to, couldn't get an education. Most women couldn't. There was very little work for women. What was low paying. So she had 6, she had to make all of their clothes herself. And she told her daughter, who we interviewed, that her dream was to go and be locked up in a jail for 3 months so that she could just read a good book. So we have a whole animation of the jail guard, welcoming her almost like it's to a party, and she's lies down in the bed in the jail and surrounded by flowers and sunshine, and she's very happy. Well, just to end this on a more personal note, why did this story jump up and grab me by the throat? Why did I feel the need to tell it? My sister and I were raised in Boston by a single mother, and my mom was an advertising copywriter. She worked for a big firm in Boston, and she made a modest salary and struggled to, keep things going. And then she learned that her salary shouldn't have been that modest, because the other men in the firm who had the same job, some of whom were just hired out of college, and she'd been there for 15 years, some of them were making twice what she was making. And that turned her into a feminist. This was the early 70s, when the feminist movement in the United States was growing. And she became the first director of Massachusetts National Organization of Women. And she led the push to get the Equal Rights Amendment through the legislature. She even dragged me there after school sometimes when I was in high school. And this was all right around the time that the women in Iceland were mobilizing. This was the years leading up to the big strike in 1975. That's the focus of our film. So I'd come home from high school in the afternoon, and I'd find like a group of angry women that I didn't even know, sitting on the living room floor and having a consciousness raising session. I mentioned this to a friend the other day, and she said, "Oh God, it's so embarrassing when our parents are passionate about something." And I have to admit that I did not realize that my mom and these women were really trying to clear hurdles for all of us. Actually, I didn't fully appreciate her activism at the time. I was even a little embarrassed about it. And I remember I rebelled by telling her one day with a straight face that my goal in life was to be a secretary. She didn't bat an eye. Before she died, she donated her feminist papers to Radcliffe Schlesinger Library for Women. And a couple of years ago, my sister and I spent a few days going through them. And it was really only then, reading her essay, How a Nice Girl Like Me Got into a Place Like Liberation, that I fully realized the slights and the put downs and really the gut punches that she encountered every day at work, and really started appreciating where her anger was coming from. So I don't have many things from my mother, but I do have her woman power necklace from the 1970s. And I found it in the corner of my jewelry box, and I started packing it for my trips to Iceland and wearing it underneath my shirt whenever we were there. And I started talking about her with these Icelandic feminist pioneers and sort of comparing notes about the 70s in this country and in their country. And I started being able to appreciate those women as I couldn't my mother at the time. And they've helped me realize that at some level, I am making this film for my mother.
All right, Pam, thank you so much. This was really fascinating, and love hearing about this. And I imagine you said it was 6 years that this took so far.
That's right.
That's a long time to be passionate about something, but obviously you have kept that fire going, and it's really interesting to hear this. So again, our audience, we welcome questions. We have time for a few questions, and I don't see any yet, but so I'll just kick off the question period with a couple of my own. So you did touch on this a little bit. Can you tell us a little more about how the strike and its aftermath did affect the quality of women's lives in Iceland?
Sure, absolutely. It triggered cascading effects over the following years that actually have changed the quality of everyone's lives in Iceland, not just the women. Because study after study shows that the more gender equal a society is, the happier the people are, the more economically prosperous, and the longer lived they are. So 5 years after the strike, Iceland elected the world's first democratically elected head of state, the fabulous Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, who then served for 16 years. And it's universally agreed that that would not have happened had the strike not happened. And of course, that opened all kinds of doors because little girls and boys growing up in Iceland in those 16 years thought that you had to be a woman to be a president. So, it right away, that changes a paradigm. That same year, the Women's Party was formed, and they focused on getting women elected to both local and state and national positions. And today, 48% of Iceland's legislature is women. That's more than any country in Europe. And think about the fact that in our country, it's 27%. And then having those women being elected to those positions meant that family-friendly, policies started being made. For example, in 2000, paternity leave was introduced. And today in Iceland, you really want to go there to have your baby because a family gets 9 months of leave, 3 months for the mother, 3 months for the father, and 3 months for them to split. And again, that changes society in so many, profound ways. And then this year, for the 13th year in a row, the World Economic Forum has ranked Iceland as #1 on their gender parity scale. And that doesn't measure everything. For example, Iceland is grappling with, there is a patriarchy still, there is a gender gap still, there's sexual violence and domestic violence, but they're ahead of every other country for the past 13 years in the things that scale does measure. And what I was recently reading a wonderful new book by Eliza Reid, who's the First Lady of Iceland. And she's recently published a book about Iceland's women. And she says something that I thought really encapsulated the state in Iceland now, because as I say, it's not a gender paradise still, even though they've come so far. She says it's the normalization of the value of gender equality across all facets of society that is so striking about Iceland. So that's an answer to your question.
Wonderful. That's inspiring and something to aspire to, I think. Think about other countries. And then something else you mentioned, which piqued my interest. How did they manage to get 9 out of 10 women to participate? That's incredible.
Oh, it was easy. No, I'm kidding. It was, the first thing, Jackie, is, and this was huge. They had a big so 1975 was named by the UN as the Year of the International Woman. So that was a challenge to countries all over the world to celebrate it in some way, to recognize it in some way. So Iceland took up the challenge and they decided to have a big conference in June. And that was a few months before UN Day, which is October 24th. And what they did at this conference was bring together not only the radical feminists, the Red Stockings, but also the middle of the road feminists who'd been around for, the whole century, and conservative women and women from the labor parties. And so they brought all these disparate women together to try and decide what to do to honor this Day of the Woman. Well, the radical feminists wanted to call it a strike, but there was no way, people were like, no, nice women don't do that. We'll get fired. No, forget it. Boo. So they came to a consensus right there, all 300 of these women, that what they would do is call it a day off. It's not a strike, it's a day off. Anyone can take a day off. And then in the subsequent months leading up to it, they really emphasize this is a day for women, to celebrate women. It's not a day against men. It's not a day against, it's a day for women. And that was something that anyone could appreciate and feel part of, including housewives who were not really recognized for the unpaid work that they were doing, in the home. So that was a big thing. And then another thing was that they just were very, very strategic in the months leading up. One of them described it to us. She said it was like the jungle telegraph. She said we created like 48,000 flyers and like 25,000 stickers, and we sent them all over the country to just be put up in the theaters and the churches and the stores, and to be, there's this kind of small groups of women in different kinds of associations. It could be sewing groups, things like that, in tiny little fishing villages. And they kind of described it as it's like this infrastructure that connects all the women in the country. And it was just there waiting to be lit up with this idea. So as these flyers and so forth started getting into the hands of these sewing groups, everybody started talking about it. And of course, they also had a fantastic, presence. They were, getting on the radio and the newspaper and the television. And then I think the final thing I would say is anybody who knows Iceland which is all of you, knows that October 24th could be a day you can't even open your door. It's so windy outside. But that day was beautiful weather. It was just gorgeous sunny weather, no wind. And as a result, everybody has decided that God must be a woman because of the weather that day.
Oh, I love it. That's great. And that brings me to a comment by one of our attendees, Veronica. Thank you. She, tying into that, she says, it's amazing that this could happen way before Facebook and online information. So how you described it, like through grapevines and the structure and informal, and then the weather helped.
And the teachers, a lot of the feminists were teachers. And what they've explained to me is they had the key to the mimeograph machine. Now, younger people on this call won't remember a mimeograph machine, but that's how things were copied in those days. So she said, I get somebody else to do some of my, desk work for me. And I just go in there and close the door. And, next thing you know, you've got 500, copies of this flyer. So the teachers were a big part of it too.
And another question from one of our attendees, Mark, thank you. He's comments, the idea of a woman's strike was played for comedy a couple thousand years ago in Greek play Lysistrata. So did you hear of any from the Icelandic men trying to interpret or diminish this event as just something funny or not to be taken seriously?
That's a fantastic question. And absolutely, the men tried to laugh it off. And didn't really, didn't necessarily take it, like, for example, in the days leading up, there were these hilarious pieces in the newspapers where they'd have like a male actor and a female actor, and they'd put a frilly apron on the man, and then the woman would be sitting there smoking a cigarette, and he'd be, like preparing coffee for her. It was like a joke. And then, I think as maybe the day before came, the joke, got a little queasy because, for example, at the bank where one of the women that we is in our film, she said the men suddenly realized, hey, wait a minute, we can't keep the bank open without them. So they would try and convince them to, well, you can come on, try to talk them out of it or joke them out of it, but no, it didn't work. But yeah, that was definitely, I think the men underestimated it, and that's why the enormity of what that happened that day kind of stayed with everybody. It was not a joke. This country stopped. So, yeah.
Thank you. And when you and I talked earlier, this is just kind of personal because I mentioned I have been reading Halldór Laxness's books, Iceland's Nobel Prize winner for literature. I'm loving them, by the way. I wish I would have been introduced to them decades ago, but here we are. And so when I told you that, you mentioned you even had a little anecdote about my new favorite author, Mr. Laxness.
Yes, well, his niece is an acclaimed author. His granddaughter. Yes, his granddaughter is an acclaimed author in Iceland today, and she was left in his care. And he's a fabulous author, and everyone that hasn't read him, I hope you'll read him. But he wrote in a very progressive way about women. His views were progressive, but he was a creature of his time, and he didn't know how to change a diaper or take care of his granddaughter. But his daughter and both of his daughters went off to the city that day and said good luck, and left him with the granddaughter. And she wrote a beautiful short story about sort of his mounting terror and sort of giving her candy, and then finally walking her to the edge of the driveway and looking to see when are those cars coming back, because he didn't know how to change her diaper.
That's just a real sweet human touch there. Another question which I had and some of our audience has is, when do we get to see the film?
Well,
the distribution process is interesting, so please tell us about that.
Yeah, so we're finishing the edit now. We'll definitely be done with what we call the offline, picture lock by Christmas. And that means in January, we'll be doing the final touches all in Iceland, finishing the music score with this fabulous Icelandic composer, Margaret Rann, working with an Icelandic sound designer on the mix, and then finally conforming the online. So by the end of January, we'll have a finished film. Before then, once we're close to picture lock, we'll start sending to festivals to have a, a launch through festivals. And that's probably where our final distribution will go. I mean, we're in conversations with a couple of distributors right now. So we'll see how that all plays out. But look for us in early 2023.
We will, and we will keep our members posted about progress there. Another question came from Jean. Thank you, Jean. What consequences or repercussions did women who are employed outside the home run up against for participating in this strike, if there were?
Some employers did threaten, that they would fire the person if they took the day off. But no one was fired, because what happened was the next day, well, first of all, everyone knew. I mean, not only this huge demonstration in Reykjavik, but there were 19 demonstrations all over the country. And there was even a strike on a boat, which we tell the story of, a boat that was halfway to Russia, and the women on the boat refused to serve the food and do the cleaning. So, it had become such an enormous thing that no one, in fact, was fired, in the end. But threats were made. It was a courageous decision for many of the women. In some workplaces, the men grudgingly said okay, but in others, they were threatened, including by female bosses. And there were also women who didn't support the strike and said, I'm not going out with you. I'm going to stay here. This is what they pay me for. I'm going to stay here. But 90% of women did it.
Wow. Now, again, as you had said, time is important here, and we look at 47 years ago. So these women ranged, some were young women, 18, 20, others were in their 30s and 40s. So you've interviewed some people who have since passed. How many of a core group, or would you say, are there many women who were involved who are still here to tell the story?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know a count, really. I wouldn't have a count. Also, for example, the Red Stockings, which were this, feminist group, which really kind of started challenging gender norms in the years leading up in a way that really, kind of shook people up and got people thinking and really paved the way for the strike or the day off. They didn't even keep a tally of who was in the Red Stockings. It was a very fluid thing. And you could be a Red Stocking one day and not another day. It was considered it was almost like going underground and then coming back up, so you wouldn't really have a count. But what I will say is that Icelandic women are very long-lived as a rule. And what is their secret? I think part of it is the fabulous hot springs that many, but the woman I mentioned who became the Supreme Court Justice, she's in her mid-80s and she teaches Tai Chi 3 times a week and we filmed her hiking, up mountains with her friends. So, there is such a core group of vigorous women who remember vividly, as though it were yesterday, those years. And also, they have been very smart about putting together these archives. They've been doing that for decades now. They put together a book about their movement and about that day off. There's 2 books in Icelandic. They did that, compiling letters that they had, snippets of newspapers, parts of their own newspaper that they published, so that so that the history would not go away when they did. So even for those that aren't here, that we couldn't speak with, we've read their writings, and now they'll be on the website of the Red Stockings that was launched today, that they've been working on for some years now.
That's wonderful.
But that's coming soon. It'll be in English.
Just a quick tie back to anticipating release early 2023. That will be in the US, but also in Iceland.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And all over the world. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Icelandic television is going to broadcast us, and we'll be sending the film to festivals, in the global north and all over Europe, as well, of course, as in the United States and Canada.
Excellent. Well, I don't see any other questions from our audience. So I think we'll just wrap it up, but we will keep in touch. Thank you so much, Pam. This was really interesting. I can't wait to see the film. I'm sure our audience is looking forward to it also. Thank you to everyone who attended our webinar. Before we go, I want to mention that if you'd like to keep informed about the film's progress, or if you want to arrange screenings, please email Pam at thelongfriday@gmail.com. And oh yeah, mark your calendars for our next program, which will be 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, November 21st. And we will be talking with Vilhjalmur Wiem. He's the new Consul General for North American Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Iceland. And we will get to learn about his role and goals for that organization. Thank you. Thakka þér fyrir, and good night. See you next time.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.